Chapter 2 Garbage Guy. I went to my classroom after gym to grab my lunch bag, and then I hurried to the cafeteria. I wanted to sit with Willie. He's my best friend. His real name is Phil, but his last name is Willis, so everyone calls him Willie. He was in Mrs. Frule's class when we were in third grade, so I only got to see him at lunch and at recess. "Hi, Willie." I put my lunch on the table and then went to get in the milk line. Standing there, I looked over at a table and saw two girls from my class, Marcia and Jane. Marcia was looking at me and whispered something to Jane. Then Jane looked at me, then they looked at each other, and then they both started laughing. I didn't like them laughing that way, but there was nothing I could do about it, so I got milk for Willie and me and went to sit down. As I was walking back to my seat, I had to go past Ben Grumson. He was standing at the end of the lunch line with Carl Burton, and when I went past Ben, he grinned at Carl and said, "Hey, look, it's Jake. He's a real trooper, you know. And sweet, too." Carl laughed, even though he's one of my friends. I don't blame him. I guess it was pretty funny. Except not to me, not at the moment. I just gritted my teeth and walked back to Willie's table. Willie nodded toward Ben and said, "What was that about?" "That?" I said. "Nothing much. I got hit out first in dodgeball 6 times in a row in gym today, and then Mr. Collins made a big deal about it, so Ben was teasing me." Willie made a face. "How can you stand being in Ben's class? He's such a jerk." "Yeah," I agreed. "He is." But then we started talking about this computer game we wanted to get so we could link up our computers at home and play against each other. So lunch was great because Willie is always fun to talk to, and because I didn't have to worry about getting whomped on the side of the head by a fat red ball. When our cookies were gone, I said, "Let's go." With me and Willie, that meant it was time to play rock, paper, scissors, because every day after lunch we play 3 games of rock, paper, scissors to see who has to carry our garbage to the trash barrel. I won the first game, but Willie won the next 2. He smiled and said, "I have to take a book back to the library, so maybe I'll see you after school." I start to clean up. Willie is not what you would call a neat eater. His orange peels were all over the place, and he had flipped some potato chips around when he popped the bag open. Plus, he had spilled some chocolate milk. So I was standing up, leaning across the table, wiping up milk with some napkins, when all of a sudden, right behind me, I heard the sound that scares the daylights out of every kid at Dupree Elementary School. "You there!" My heart just about jumped out of my mouth because only one person at my school has a voice like that, and that's Mrs. Carp, the principal. "Stop that! Put that stuff down and stand up straight!" Mrs. Carp was almost yelling, so the whole cafeteria got completely quiet. She has the kind of voice that makes kindergartners cry. It's so loud that I think she could break windows if she really shouted. Mrs. Carp came over and stood right next to me. She looked around to make sure that everyone in the cafeteria was paying attention, and then with her huge voice said, "Every day our cafeteria helpers have to spend extra time after lunch cleaning up in here. Take a good look at this table." And she pointed at the mess in front of me. 2 ripped-up lunch bags, a squished chocolate milk carton, 3 bent straws, a wad of soggy napkins, and a pile of orange peels and potato chips. It was not a pretty picture. I gulped, frozen with fear. Then Mrs. Carp said, "Jake Drake has not only started to clean up his own things, but he was also cleaning up the mess left by some bad citizen." I looked up, and over by the door I saw Willie standing there. Willie, the bad citizen. He made this scared face at me, like maybe he thought I was going to point to him and say, there he is, the table trasher." But I would never do that. Mrs. Carp had something in her hand. It was one of those patrol belts, the kind crossing guards wear. She leaned over toward me, and before I could do anything, she looped the strap over my head, pulled the belt around my waist, and hooked it together. It was way too big for me, so it sagged all over. Then she smiled and said, "See this patrol belt?" Which was a stupid question, because the thing is bright orange. It's impossible not to see it. "This week we're all going to make a special effort to keep our lunchroom clean. Jake Drake is going to wear this belt during lunch for the rest of the week. That will help to remind all of us not to leave any trash on our tables. And I want everyone to give Jake a nice round of applause for being such a fine lunchroom citizen. Jake, you've set a good example for everyone." And then Mrs. Carp started clapping and looking around the cafeteria, so everyone else had to clap too. And I saw Willie over in the doorway clapping like mad and grinning at me. And once everyone was clapping, what did Mrs. Carp do? She stopped clapping. She reached over, and with all the kids in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades watching, she patted me on the head. The clapping ended, and after she smiled at me once more, Mrs. Carp walked away. I finished cleaning up the lunch table and tried not to feel like everyone was looking at me, which is not easy when you're wearing a big floppy orange patrol belt. I got out of the cafeteria fast. Willie was waiting for me in the hallway. He pointed at the orange belt and pretended like it was something amazing. He opened his eyes up real wide and said, "Gee, can I touch that?" I didn't smile. I walked past him because I had to get back to Mrs. Snaven's room fast so I could take off the stupid thing and stick it inside my desk. Willie caught up and said, "Don't get mad, Jake. I'm just kidding." "Well, it's not funny," I said. I didn't like what was happening. When lunch period was over, all the kids in my class went back to our room and we sat down and got out our math workbooks. Mrs. Snaven waited until all the kids got quiet and sat in their seats. Then she said, "Before we start on math, I need someone to take this note down to the office for me." Right away, about 6 kids put up their hands because some kids love to do that kind of stuff. Mrs. Snaven looked right past all those waving hands. She looked right at me and she smiled and said, "I think I'll have Jake take it." She held out the note toward me, so I had to get up from my seat, walk to the front of the room, and get it from her. Then Mrs. Snaven said, "Be sure to hurry right back, Jake, because we're going to work on our number line project, and you have to be my special computer helper, okay?" And I could feel every kid in the class looking at me. They weren't saying anything, they weren't even whispering, but right then I heard what they were thinking anyway. They were thinking, "Teacher's pet." And Mrs. Snaven didn't help. All during the last 2 hours of the day, she kept asking me to remind her how to do different things on the computer or to go over and help this kid and then help that kid. And the worst part was that nobody really needed help, and they didn't want help, especially from the teacher's pet. And Mrs. Snaven came and watched me when it was my turn to use the computer, and she said, "It's so wonderful to see a real expert use this math program." I thought the day would never end. But it did. When I finally ran outside to wait for my bus, I was in a pretty bad mood, and when I was standing in line, a fifth-grade boy went by and said, "Hey, garbage guy, I think Mrs. Carp is in love with you." And then all his friends laughed, and another kid said, "Yeah, garbage guy, maybe you can clean up my lunch table tomorrow and do a good job, because you don't want to make the principal unhappy." Bus number 3 came and I got on. I sat on the outside edge of the seat so no one could sit with me. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just sat there, staring at the dirty black floor. All around me, kids were talking and joking, yelling and laughing. Not me. I felt terrible. It wasn't fair. I didn't want to be a teacher's pet. I didn't try to get anybody's attention. It wasn't my fault. I felt like I was trapped. I looked up and my stop was next. When the bus stopped, I jumped up and got to the front of the bus. I wanted to be the first one off. I was ready for this day to be over. It was real noisy, and the lady driving the bus turned around in her seat and shouted, "Quiet!" When everyone stopped yelling and talking, the driver looked around and said, "You kids have got to settle down. It's not safe to drive when it gets so loud and crazy. You should all be sitting still in your seats, and if you talk at all, you talk quietly. Understand? On this whole bus, only one kid has been a good bus rider today, and that's this kid right here." And with all the kids on the bus watching her, the bus driver reached over and patted me on the head.